So there was a time when Square Enix was considered to be the king of JRPGs. I mean, you think back to when they made some of the best RPGs ever made. Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy Tactics, and Chrono Trigger. These were all amazing games that had great storylines, great artwork, but one constant thing was that they were turn-based RPGs. A subgenre that, seems to be dwindling, unfortunately, by today's standards. However, along comes a game called Octopath Traveler 1. It was really good. It embodied all of these elements. It was fundamentally flawed in some cases, but it was still a great JRPG with a world of potential. And then, of course, Square Enix releases Octopath Traveler 2. And this game is not only a Game of the Year contender, this game is not only a great JRPG, but this game is quite possibly, in my opinion, one of the best JRPGs of all time. It is nearly flawless in every aspect. Whether you talk about the great visual art style of 2D, 3D sprites, when you pan through the vistas and how the different worlds and different cities look and the art that goes into it, I mean, it's just fantastic. Whether you have full-on voice lines, voiceovers are prominent of the entire game. Any main quest, the entire story is done with voiceovers, which is absolutely fantastic. And then, of course, you have the combat. The combat being a turn-based JRPG of classic old. And if you look at some of the names of their best games, they hold true today. Many people will tell you Final Fantasy VI is one of the best games. They'll tell you Chrono Trigger is the best JRPG of all time. I mean, they have that reputation, and they are showing it with Octopath Traveler 2. When you start your game, you have a choice of one of 8 characters. In my humble opinion, I think starting with Oswald the Scholar is the best choice, mainly because you go through his first 2 chapters back to back without acquiring any other characters. It's a really good starting point to learn the game's systems. He's got a very good story, and of course, he has the lovely perk that every time you enter a fight, he scans the opposition to reveal one of their weaknesses. So he does have a lot of merits, and of course, being a scholar, he has all the mage powers and the elements. He's just a very good starting character. But when you get into the brass tacks of this game, everything about it is top tier quality. Whether it's the writing, whether it's the voice actors, the combat is very, very addicting. The combat itself moves away from the ATB gauge, and instead it's set turns from the first game. A lot of what they took from the first game has been improved with the second game. Everything from a faster paced combat, more abilities, more combos, more builds. You now have control over a full day-night cycle in the game world, and when you're on days, your character has a certain path action that can be done during the roaming, or you switch to night and have a separate path action. If you use, a character like Oswald, for example, on night he can mug an opposition and steal something, but during the day he can investigate for information. It's 2 different things that he can do, whether or not you have day or night, and you have full control over this. In terms of the storytelling, the stories for the 8 characters are pretty damn good for the most part. My personal favorites were Hikari, Temenos, Throne, and Oswald. But unfortunately, and this is the one gripe I have with this game, and the one gripe I had is that not all of the stories are up to the same level. Now, obviously, this is subjective. This could just be a me thing. But there were some characters like Agnia and Casti where I felt their stories weren't onto the same level as the other characters. But one of the things that I loved about Octopath Traveler 2 in comparison to Octopath Traveler 1 was how they bring these characters together. They actually have a stronger focus of bringing all 8 individual characters together. One of the flaws with the first game was you had 8 random stories. They didn't feel interconnected. And then they team up at the end to fight the final boss. In this game, they actually wove the story into it far better. You actually have quests that require multiple characters to be in your party in order to have that story play out. And all of these stories will come together into the end to face the final boss. So it's done really, really well in terms of bringing the characters together. One of the criticisms of the first game was the levels and how you had to grind in order to progress through the game. This has been addressed in Octopath Traveler 2. There was no grinding required. In my 60 to 65 hour playthrough before I saw the credits, I don't think I grinded at all. Maybe I did once or twice for a couple levels because the individual character was a little low. But also those were the characters that I didn't like playing the most, so I kind of had them on the bench most of the time, which is kind of my fault. But overall, I didn't really have to grind, and if you do a lot of exploring in this game, you don't have to grind at all. There is easily 100 hours worth of content here, and if you are the type of person to explore every nook and cranny, you'll never have to grind because you'll have your characters over-leveled, if nothing else. But obviously, being a JRPG, you have the RPG elements, you have all the stats, all the jobs. There are 8 jobs for the characters, and then you have the sub-jobs that can be added to them later. And of course, you have your secret jobs, which I won't dive into what kind of jobs they are, but you have your secret jobs as well. And obviously, with this stats and how you build compositions, and you can go into a boss fight and lose because your team isn't built properly. But then because you fought them the first time, okay, you change it up, change your jobs, change your formation, and then you can beat the boss because now you're properly equipped for it. One of the other things that I loved about it was the bosses themselves. The boss battles, there is a lot of boss battles, and they all have their different strategies, they all have their different tactics, they all have their different weaknesses that are required, and you have to compose a team that matches it up. So the only luxury you have in knowing that is when you play a character's story, whatever character you are using and you go to a boss, just know that that character's primary weapons, at least one of them, will always be a weakness because it is that character's story. So that's a pro tip, that when you play this game, be mindful of who your main character is, what story you're doing at that time, and what their weapons are, and then you always have a weakness of sorts within your squad no matter what. In terms of difficulty, the game itself isn't too hard, especially if you do natural exploring, because like I said earlier, you will be over leveled. But when you get to the end game and you start getting to the real secret bosses and the secret stuff, yeah, there is some pretty challenging bosses, as they should be, because this is a staple of all JRPGs. The best boss fights, the best goodies are always tied behind a very tough fight. So it is very, very good, and I love the boss fights. Overall, I loved my time with Octopath Traveler 2. In my opinion, it is a Game of the Year contender. Don't let the naysayers fool you when they talk about, oh, the graphics is pixelated. It is a beautiful looking game with a very great composed audio score. I mean, the music in this game fits the art very, very well. I fell in love with this game. If you have played those classic JRPGs I mentioned earlier, this game is 100% a must play. You must play this game if you have the platform to do so. If you've never played those generations of games, if you're unsure about those generation of games, I will still tell you go play Octopath Traveler 2. You don't need to play the first one. The story is completely separate, so be aware of that going in. But this is hands down one of the greatest RPGs ever made. Game of the Year contender. For me, I'm giving Octopath Traveler 2 a 9.5 out of 10. This is Veteran Gamer, and I hope to see you guys next time.